I'm Michael Zumo. I'm the president of the Long Island Lawyers Chapter of the Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy Studies. I would like to thank all of you for coming out tonight. We have two very interesting speakers who I'm sure you've seen many times on television and heard on the radio. They're very frequently on Fox News, some of the talk radio shows.
I have to do Bill Maher next week.
All right. But he could be entertaining.
My official spot on that panel is Pinata.
So what is that your penance for?
A previous life, I hope.
I'm going to start off, my first introduction will be the gentleman to my immediate left, John Fund. John Fund is a national affairs columnist for National Review magazine and a contributor to the Fox News Channel and a contributor to the Wall Street Journal. He is considered a notable expert on American politics and the nexus between politics and economics. Mr. Fund previously served as a columnist and editorial board member for the Wall Street Journal. He is the author of several books, including Stealing Elections, How Voter Fraud Threatens Our Democracy, and The Dangers of Regulation Through Litigation. He's also a co-author with our other panel member, Hans von Spakovsky, on Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk. And John was good enough to bring a few copies of this book.
Grant Lally knows something about that topic.
Yes. Well, he read your book. I think he read your earlier book. Okay. Okay, Mr. Fund worked as a research analyst for the California legislature in Sacramento before beginning his journalism career as a reporter for the syndicated columnists Roland Evans and Robert Novak. Or the late Evans and Novak.
Late, great.
Okay, Roll Call, the newspaper of Capitol Hill, has called him the Tom Paine of the modern congressional reform movement. He has won awards from the Institute for Justice and the School Choice Alliance. And that is John Fund.
Okay. Thank you all for coming.
Okay.
Hans.
Okay.
Obviously, the subject of Eric Holder is very daunting, so we needed this whole bottle of wine. Even Hans decided he needed some fortification. I'm going to do something a little different. This is the first time I'll have done this in talking about the book. I'm going to back into the discussion of Eric Holder because I think that there's some events happening in Washington regarding President Obama that are very pressing and very topical. So I'll get to Eric Holder, but it'll be through a back door. Today we had a Malaysian jetliner shot down over Ukraine by pro-Russian elements. 23 Americans are dead, along with dozens and dozens of others. The president is in New York City as we speak, fundraising. Two separate fundraisers. The morning after the Benghazi attack in 2012, where our ambassador and 3 other Americans died, the president chose to get on a plane and fly to Las Vegas for 2 fundraisers. Do you detect a pattern here?
Yeah.
This is no longer funny. This president is, in the words of Congressman Henry Cuellar, a Texas Democrat, the president is, after he refused to go to the border because he had to go to fundraisers in Dallas and San Antonio and Houston, the president is aloof, detached, and bizarre, his fellow Democrat. The Dallas Morning News published an editorial saying, I think the only way we can get the president to the Mexican border is for the Democratic National Committee to hold fundraisers in El Paso and Brownsville and Mineola and all the border cities. Maybe that'll get him there. Democrats are just agog. I mean, privately they will tell you, we've never seen anything like this. The president goes to Denver and he is photographed drinking a beer and playing pool and shaking the guy who has a horse head on mask. And then the president the next day says, I'm not going to the border because I don't do photo ops. What can you say? Except this president is no longer connected to reality. Democrats are fleeing from him. Senator Udall, the president went to Denver to have a fundraiser for Senator Udall, who's up for election this November. Senator Udall didn't go to his own fundraiser. Apparently he had to go pick up the dry cleaning. In suburban Virginia this week, the Democratic candidate for Congress wouldn't show up with the president in Fairfax County, Virginia, which overwhelmingly voted for Obama twice, but he couldn't be seen. The president is allowed to raise money for the Democratic Party, but just not allowed to appear in public with real voters because he scares the people too much. This is very serious. The Financial Times, which is a leading financial newspaper in Britain, says, by all evidence, this president does not particularly enjoy the job of chief executive. It's like he's into early retirement. And but now what could possibly be happening? And most of you know Bob Beckel, who's the Democratic punching bag on 5. But he's a real Democratic player. He was Walter Mondale's campaign manager in 1984. He's been a Democratic campaign manager for over 50 candidates. And he has a lot of good contacts in the Democratic political community. This is what he said yesterday. Greg Gutfeld, his counterpart on the 5, says, doesn't Obama have anyone in his circle that says, like, dude, time for an intervention. You're scaring the blank out of the country. You've got to stop playing pool. It's time for an intervention, but the groupies in the media, they won't help him. This is Beckel's response. Greg, I talked to a guy who was intimately involved in the Obama campaigns, both of them. And I said to him, can you guys give me anything to work with? Anything? It would be nice. He had nothing. And he said about Greg's point about these close people around him, he said, you have to know what it's like to try to get through Valerie Jarrett, the presidential counselor, and Michelle Obama. And I think that's a tough deal for anybody on a staff to do. This guy is not on the staff. We made it pretty clear to him that the Stepford women, or maybe something to that, are involved because the president is living in a zone that nobody else goes to. In other words, the president is being protected by his staff. He's not running the country, someone else is. I don't know who that is, but we may have his future historians looking back on this time as the time of President Valerie Jarrett. And there is precedent. I spoke to a presidential historian whose name most of you would recognize, who said, we've never seen anything quite like this. This is very similar to what happened with Woodrow Wilson when he was debilitated in the last 18 months of his term of office, and his aides and Edith Wilson, his wife, ran everything. Now, I'm not saying that's happening. I'm not saying that's the reality, but it's the closest thing that we've ever had in our presidential history to what's happening now. So why does this make Eric Holder important? Eric Holder is the heat shield for Barack Obama. He's the guy who will say the things Barack Obama no longer says. For example, on race. Ever since Barack Obama stupidly talked about the Cambridge cop and how racist he was when he was involved with a Harvard professor who was a friend of Obama's, Obama has said very little about race. I think he's delegated that to Eric Holder. So you have Eric Holder go out and say, we're a nation of cowards when it comes to race. You have Eric Holder corrupt the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, and Hans, who worked there during the last decade, can testify to that. And you have Eric Holder come out for the first time in a network interview in 4 years, and I think our book had something to do with that, flushing him out, because he's been in a witness protection program when it comes to media interviews. Eric Holder said the other day, well, racial animus is behind a lot of the criticism launched against him and Obama. Well, you know, the easiest way to deflect real issues is to simply cry racism in a crowded political theater. And that's what these people are doing. So Eric Holder is Obama's heat shield. He's the guy who says things Obama can't say. He's the guy who implements Obama's vision when it comes to law enforcement. And there's a lot happening in the Justice Department. As Hans has written in his part of the book, 125,000 employees, 40 divisions, everything from environmental crimes to antitrust to civil rights, a wide platform. I would say easily the Attorney General is the official who, on a day-to-day basis, affects most Americans' everyday lives more than any other cabinet officer. And of course, Eric Holder has also been, through the Office of Legal Counsel of the Justice Department, which gives the President legal advice, been in charge or in supervising a tremendous expansion of executive power, beyond anything Richard Nixon would ever have imagined, beyond anything FDR would ever have imagined. And this expansion of executive power goes throughout the government. We already have the President publicly discussing whether or not he'll have executive orders allowing another 9 million undocumented future potential Democratic voters to stay in this country, which is what the real, I guess, the politically correct version of an illegal alien is now. And I have to say, Eric Holder has been there every step of the way, apologizing and justifying an expansion of executive power our founding fathers would have been aghast at. But the courts are slowly keeping up, or catching up with him, and you're seeing a sea change in mainstream legal opinion now about Eric Holder and the overreach. In the last 2.5 years, Hans and I document, the last 2.5 years, the Supreme Court has 13 times ruled against the position of the Obama Justice Department in these areas unanimously. Not 5-4, not 6-3, not 7-2, not 8-1, unanimously, including Obama's own appointees, Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, who was his own number 3 official at the Justice Department. And these cases are consistent. The most recent ones were involved recess appointments, both the National Labor Relations Board, which were struck down, and the privacy of your cell phone, whether a court order had to be obtained in order to access your cell phone records. This administration is a disaster for civil liberties advocates, and I'm disappointed that civil liberties advocates on the left haven't been more vocal on this. Last year, the Obama administration went to the Supreme Court arguing in favor of a position in the case of Jones versus New York, in which they maintained that the federal government has the power, or should have the power, to put a GPS tracking device on any one of your cars without a court order, without a search warrant, without any evidence that you've committed a crime. Luckily, the court said no, 9-0. But there are no limits to what these people will try and do. And whether it's the NSA or whether it's the kind of cases like the Gibson guitar case that Hans so splendidly outlined in the book, these people need no stinking badges. They don't need no stinking rules. There's a famous phrase in the poem, The Incredible Bread Machine, where a businessman who's been persecuted by the Justice Department in this poem asks the judge why this is happening to me. The judge looks down at him and says, "The rule of law in complex times has proved itself deficient. We much prefer the rule of men. It's vastly more efficient." And what Eric Holder has brought is the greatest challenge to the rule of law that any Attorney General has posed since John Mitchell served Richard Nixon. And that did not turn out well. John Mitchell went to prison and Richard Nixon went into historical ignominy. The rule of men, the rule of one man, Eric Holder, or the rule of 2 men, Eric Holder and Barack Obama, is increasingly threatening us. Now the good news is, I think the House is doing a good job with oversight. They will be joined probably by a Republican Senate in November, and we can discuss that. And together, they can do a lot. They can, for example, go to President Obama and say, about those judges you've appointed, there will be no more appointments unless we get something reined in at the Justice Department, if there's a Republican Senate. Congress can put budget bills on the President's desk, the power of the purse, and say, you don't have a line on veto. You either have to sign this bill, as we have put in restrictions on the Justice Department, or you veto the whole thing. Take your choice. There's some bills the President will have to sign. There are some restrictions the President will have to accept. And I think the courts increasingly are on to the President, as I mentioned during the Supreme Court record. There will be other cases in which the power of this administration will be reined in. Now, there will be challenges for the next President, whoever that is, to try to restore us to something approaching normalcy. And that's not going to be easy. But I do believe that the people are awakening to this danger. And one of the reasons Hans and I wrote this book is to alert you to the specifics of this danger, because our freedom in part lies in all of you, whether you're lawyers or non-lawyers, communicating to your friends, your colleagues, your neighbors, and your relatives the threat we are under. And what is it Edmund Burke said? The only thing that is required for evil to triumph is for good men and women to do nothing. And that's the position we're in. If we do something, if we do our duty as citizens, especially in November, I have every confidence that this administration will have its wings clipped and its powers curbed, and then we can have a real debate about what kind of country we want in 2016. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Okay, our second speaker tonight, Hans von Spakovsky. Actually, both of these gentlemen have appeared before this chapter 2 times over the last 5 years.
Either we were very good or we didn't get the message across.
Well, we did invite you back.
Because we did get the message across.
Okay, Hans von Spakovsky, legal fellow in the Heritage Foundation's Center for Legal and Judicial Studies, where he researches and writes about aspects of election law, such as campaign finance, voter fraud, and voter identification, as well as registration and equipment issues. Before joining Heritage in 2008, he served 2 years as a member of the Federal Election Commission, the authority charged with enforcing campaign finance laws for congressional and presidential elections, including public funding. Previously, Mr. von Spakovsky worked at the Justice Department as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, providing expertise in enforcing the Voting Rights Act and the Help America Vote Act of 2002. Mr. von Spakovsky also has served on the Board of Advisors of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission and on the Fulton County, Georgia Board of Registrations and Elections, and also the Fairfax County, Virginia Election Board and the Virginia Advisory Board to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. His analysis and commentary have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Times, Politico, Human Events, as well as such outlets as National Review Online and Town Hall. He has testified before state and congressional committees and made presentations to the National Association of Secretaries of State, it's a surprise, the Federalist Society, and the National Conference of State Legislatures and the American Legislative Exchange Council. Mr. von Spakovsky is a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Vanderbilt University School of Law. Hans, you have the floor.
Well, I've been here often enough that Mike's able to pronounce my name, which is better than Sean Hannity can do. This is really the. There's been a lot.
Just Hans O. Spakowski.
This is really the first book that's come out looking at Eric Holder's tenure at the Justice Department, and he's been there now almost 6 years. And what you need to understand about Eric Holder is that what drives him is ideology, politics, loyalty to the president. He is an ideologue first, a politician second, and a lawyer and the Attorney General a very distant third. And the reason that is dangerous is because the Attorney General and the Justice Department is probably the most powerful domestic cabinet agency in the country. The Justice Department and its prosecutors can break any individual, any business, strip them of their assets and everything else they own and put them in jail. And when you have someone who's willing to abuse that authority for political purposes and ideology, it is extremely dangerous. And I have to tell you, when John and I were researching the book, look, we spent a lot of time watching the Justice Department, and we've both written a lot of articles about DOJ over the past couple of years, but even we were surprised at how many cases we found where judges threw out prosecutions that the Justice Department had started accusing the prosecutors of prosecutorial abuse. which is extremely shocking and something that should concern everyone. I mean, we called the book Obama's Enforcer, not just because it's a catchy title, but because it really describes Eric Holder. Every time that the president has twisted, broken, bent, or ignored the law, the person at his side advising him how to do it and get away with it has been Eric Holder. And again, that is not the kind of person you want as the Attorney General. Look, Attorney Generals have to walk a very fine line. On the one hand, yeah, they're appointed by the president, and yes, they should be loyal to and consider what the president's priorities are in terms of law enforcement. But they are the Attorney General, and they're sworn to uphold the law in an objective, non-biased manner. And so that is a higher duty and something that they need to keep in mind when there's a conflict. When there's a conflict between loyalty to the president and upholding the law, past attorney generals have had their loyalty be to upholding the law. And you know, some people may look at this as a partisan attack. It's not. We've had very good attorney generals in the past from both political parties and from Democratic and Republican presidents. Eric Holder doesn't fit that bill. And in fact, one of the lawyers that we interviewed, a career lawyer who was hired during the Clinton administration, told us that Eric Holder is the worst attorney general since Mitchell under Nixon. And actually he made Mitchell look like an amateur. Eric Holder has completely politicized the department in a way that is really unprecedented. It has never been seen before. We start off in the book with a little bit of his history and how he got to where he was. And you know, none of this is a surprise. Most people don't remember this, but you know, he was the #2 guy at the Justice Department during the Clinton administration. And it wasn't just that he was the #2 guy at Justice, he was the go-to guy for the Clinton White House. Why? Because they didn't trust Janet Reno to make the right political decisions. Him, they trusted. And one of the best examples of this, and it shows you how he's more interested in politics than justice, was something that happened at the end of the administration. Now, I'm sure all of you have heard about the Mark Rich pardons. Okay, the Mark Rich pardons where Eric Holder overrode the recommendations of the pardon attorney at Justice. The Justice Department has a pardons office, and there are lawyers there who review any applications made for pardons, and they make recommendations to the president on whether or not the pardon should be granted. Eric Holder overrode those recommendations to say that, yeah, Mark Rich should get a pardon, despite the fact that never before in the history of the United States had the president issued a pardon to a fugitive. Pardons are issued to people who have been tried, convicted, and put in prison normally. This man was an international fugitive who had fled to Switzerland. But of course, he had given huge amounts of money to the campaign. Now, this sounds bad, but this is not as bad as the other pardon scandal that he was involved in. The worst thing he did, and it shows you, like I said, how he was willing to sacrifice national security for politics, is that, remember, at the end of the Clinton administration, Hillary Clinton was starting her campaign to be your United States Senator in New York. And Eric Holder arranged for the president to provide pardons for 16 terrorists in federal prison. They were the members of the FALN, which was a Puerto Rican terrorist group. They were responsible for something like 135 bombings, armed robberies, and one of the bombings, as you all probably know, killed 4 people at a tavern in New York City. Right. Now, what was interesting about this was that the pardons attorney strongly recommended against it. The victims didn't want it. The FBI didn't want it. These people were so dangerous that when they were sentenced by the federal judge, they threatened the judge in court. And in fact, they were completely remorseless. The judge said that if the death penalty had been an option, he would have imposed it. Not only that, but they had not applied for pardons. They hadn't applied for pardons. But you see, the consultants for Hillary Clinton were all saying to Hillary Clinton and to the Attorney General that this would really help her with the Puerto Rican vote. And so they issued pardons to these 16 terrorists who had killed and murdered across the United States in many different places. And that is the man who was confirmed to be the Attorney General. Now we go through everything from the Civil Rights Division to things like national security. Let me start with national security for a second because I just finished talking about that. There's an interesting pattern in the way Eric Holder has handled this. First of all, after 9/11, they established a national security division at the Justice Department. And who did he very prominently hire into the National Security Division to help direct what the policy of that division should be? All these very prominent lawyers from large New York and Washington law firms who had volunteered pro bono their time to help terrorists being held in Guantanamo Bay. That's kind of like hiring mob lawyers and putting them into the organized crime task force to advise you on how you should go after the mob to break them. The other thing about this is that he has gone back to the criminal model of how to deal with terrorism, which, as you all know, was spectacularly unsuccessful during the Clinton administration, and a lot of people blame that for the intelligence failures that led to 9/11. Third, he has opened up an unprecedented number of leak investigations, leaks of classified information. In fact, he's opened up more investigations than any prior Attorney General combined.
All of them.
All of them combined. But there's a very interesting pattern to those investigations. What you find is that when they can find low-level of people, employees of the federal government who have leaked this classified information, well, those people they prosecute. But any of the very substantial leaks that have come out of the White House, and there's no question they've come out of the White House, everything from the very dangerous identification of SEAL Team 6 as the team that killed bin Laden, which put their entire families, because they're based in Norfolk, people know they're based in Norfolk, in danger, to the leaking of the Stuxnet virus. You all recall, that's the virus that the CIA very successfully inserted into the computers in Iran that ran their cyclotrons in order to slow down and sabotage their effort to build a nuclear bomb. Very successful effort. These leaks all came out of the White House, and they were all intended to make the president look tough and help him in his re-election effort. The people who leaked those, they haven't been prosecuted. And in fact, there's a very kind of funny thing about that, and that is that the leaks coming out of the White House were so bad that they made Robert Gates, the Secretary of Defense, extremely angry. And so he sent a note to the head of the National Security Council at the White House saying that he wanted to have a meeting with him to discuss Gates's proposal for a new strategic communications procedure. Gets a meeting, goes to the White House, gets in to see the head of the National Security Council, and the head of the National Security Council, well, what's this new strategic communications proposal that you've got? And Robert Gates looked at him and said, shut the blank up, because the leaks coming out of the White House are hurting national security. The abuses that have run through the Justice Department in other areas run from the Civil Rights Division, which has done everything from, for example, suing school districts, including I think one in New York, for having a dress code that prevents boys from showing up in drag at school, saying that that's sex discrimination, to abusing the FACE Act. The FACE Act is this law that was passed to prevent violence at abortion clinics. During the Bush administration, there was one prosecution, but they have launched prosecution after prosecution of individuals who were not engaging in violence or intimidation outside of abortion clinics, but were simply engaging in protected First Amendment activities. And the law, when it was passed by Congress, made it very clear. This law was only intended to prevent violence, not to stop people's First Amendment activity to either protest about abortion or to try to provide sidewalk counseling. Case after case that they have filed have been dismissed by federal judges. And in one of them, down in Florida, the judge made it very clear that he thought the case was politically motivated because they had absolutely no evidence to show that this particular woman had violated the law. And you find case after case like that. Another
New York
one.
City firefighters.
Yeah, you know, they sued New York City firefighters, firefighting over claiming racial discrimination, and they basically ignored a Supreme Court decision on this in order to force the city to throw out, tests for firefighters just because they believed not enough African Americans had done well in it, even though the Supreme Court said you can't do that. You can't engage in the kind of discriminatory behavior. You know, another example of this.
Well, just to add something.
Yeah.
The New York City firefighter department is now required because of the Justice Department's intervention. It must hire applicants who failed 70% of the questions on the test. 70%.
Yeah, in fact, the same thing happened in Ohio with the police department, and the head of the local NAACP was extremely angry about it and saying the police department should not be forced to hire people who fail these tests. But that's what the department forced them to do. In the environmental area, they have also abused the law greatly. One of the worst examples of this, something we talk about that John mentioned, was, they went after the Gibson Guitar Company. A heralded American company who has produced some of the most famous guitars in the world for people like the Beatles and others. And they showed up, the Justice Department showed up with its agents at the offices and factories of Gibson Guitar as if they were raiding a drug cartel or a mob operation. Seized their records, seized hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of wood that was going to be used to make fretboards for the guitars. And why was all this going on? Well, because they claimed that the wood had been illegally imported from India and Madagascar, despite the fact that both India and Madagascar said that, no, there wasn't a problem with this wood. But they were prompted into doing this by environmental political allies of the administration. At the end of the case, they entered into a settlement agreement, and to show you how bad the Justice Department's case was, they agreed to return all the wood that they had seized, and which had prevented the company from making guitars. Now, the interesting thing about this was that the Martin Company used exactly the same wood from the same sources, but the Martin Company wasn't prosecuted. And of course, the difference between the two companies was the head of Gibson Guitar was a outspoken Republican, whereas the head of Martin Guitar is a big contributor to Democratic causes. And that again shows how politics drives what they do. The contempt for the Constitution, the abuse of power, is also something we talk about. John talks about the 13 cases, but if you actually look at the entire administration, there are 20 cases that the administration has lost 9-0. Now, when you lose a case 9-0 before the Supreme Court, including all the liberal justices, including your own former Solicitor General, you are taking an extreme position before the court. And the positions they've taken are so bad that the Solicitor General's office, who is the officer of the Justice Department who represents the Justice Department and the government, the Supreme Court, they've gone from having a historically winning record, they usually win about 70% of the cases, to having a losing record. And again, that tells you how extreme the positions are that they've taken. I'm sure all of you know Eric Holder's the first Attorney General in the history of the United States to be held in contempt of Congress. And the reason for it is that he wouldn't turn over documents related to Operation Fast and Furious, which is probably the most reckless law enforcement operation the Justice Department has ever done. It led to the death of a U.S. Border Patrol agent, and it has caused deaths of hundreds of Mexican citizens, something that's continuing today. We go through all of this. We've talked to a lot of sources inside the Justice Department, and all of it paints a very sad picture of what's going on. And the damage is such that, frankly, it's going to be extremely difficult for a future president, even one who picks a really good attorney general, to try to repair this and clean it up. And one of the biggest reasons for that, and I'll end with this, is that they have been abusing the civil service career rules for the past 6 years. And they have been hiring political and ideological cronies, particularly from advocacy organizations, into the career ranks. And that's not being reported on. The New York Times, the Washington Post couldn't care about it, and no one's doing anything about it. And those people, unfortunately, are going to stay there, even if a Republican wins the next election. And the lawyers there are so radical. I've been in Washington 12 years now, and the lawyers that I've seen there in the Justice Department today are the most radical left-wing lawyers I've ever encountered, which says quite a bit, because there are a lot of radical left-wing lawyers in Washington working for advocacy organizations. So the corruption inside the Justice Department is something that is unfortunately going to last, and it's going to be very difficult to clean up. Thanks.
Please, Q&A.
All right, Q&A. Questions? Ray, we'll start with you.
Could you talk for a minute about how, in addition to all of the, I mean, I know you just scratched the surface because you only have a little time here, but one of the things that's bothering me the most is how they're using the auspices of government to do what they can't do legislatively, like whispering into the ears of banks not to do business with gun companies so that the gun companies have to close so they can backdoor the gun control, that sort of thing.
Yeah, you're talking about, has everybody heard about Operation Choke Point?
Exactly.
Operation Choke Point is this horrible program that Justice put together with the Treasury Department. And what they've been doing is they've been going to banks and to credit card processors and telling them that if you do business with what we consider to be risky industries, you will get added scrutiny from the Justice Department, and we may sue you under various rules governing financial institutions.
Otherwise, have a nice day.
Yeah. And the list that they have of what they consider to be risky institutions. Now, normally you would think a risky institution is an institution that, you know, perhaps is involved in the drug trade or something like that. Why no? There are risky institutions, for example, are gun dealers who sell guns. And if you look at this list, what's clear is that the industries being listed are industries that they disfavor from an ideology standpoint. And they want to use these bureaucratic rules to basically squeeze them out. They can't outlaw the Second Amendment. They can't outlaw gun dealers. So the way to do it is to make it impossible, for example, for gun dealers to have customers who can use credit cards. And some of the banks have already given in and started dropping the accounts of people in these various industries. One of the things we talk about, and this shows how this administration is different, is that in the book we describe criminal prosecutions that this administration has engaged in, where they've engaged in behavior that the Justice Department has not done before. And by that, I'm talking about prosecutorial abuse of the worst kind. And I'll just give you one example, okay? The Justice Department prosecuted several police officers down in New Orleans for things that had happened right after Hurricane Katrina. The judge in the case wrote one of the most scathing criticisms I have ever read of the prosecutors. Why? Because you know what the prosecutors were doing? They were posting anonymous blogs at the Times-Picayune News website, that's the main newspaper in Louisiana, in which they were attacking the defendants' lawyers. And included in that was the #2 person in the New Orleans office of the U.S. Attorney's Office, and also included in that was the lawyer in the Civil Rights Division who was what's called the taint attorney. Now, those of you who know about this know that when a police officer is investigated for something that happened, and they're investigated and talked to by the Criminal Investigative Division, right? They have to answer all the questions put to them. They cannot assert the Fifth Amendment. Because of that, the Supreme Court has said that any information that the police officer gives to the CID as they're trying to find out what happened can't be used against them in a prosecution. So the Justice Department appointed this lawyer in the Civil Rights Division whose job it was to protect the defendants and to make sure that the prosecution team did not use any of the tainted evidence they weren't supposed to use. She was one of the people posting blogs attacking the defendants whose rights she was supposed to be protecting. I can tell you that has not happened before at the Justice Department, and it's an example of how extreme they have gotten and the kind of abuse they're willing to engage in their criminal prosecution.
Okay, thank you. Marilyn?
Was, this is probably rhetorical, but was there any punishment of the person who was doing that?
Well, the judge, after issuing the opinion, sent a letter to the Louisiana Bar Association saying that some of the attorneys down in the Louisiana office, they should consider disbarring them. The taint attorney who works at the Civil Rights Division in Washington, D.C., as I understand it, has not been terminated and has not been disciplined.
Probably got a bonus.
Well, Hans won't mention this, but I will also say that in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, there was an ongoing attempt using intimidation, smears, and name-calling to discredit the few conservatives or moderates who were in that division. And this is not my opinion, this is the opinion of the Inspector General of the Department of Justice. Hans was one of those people who was there during part of that time. And the Office of Inspector General found that there were people who had engaged in extremely unprofessional behavior, unethical behavior, in smearing the reputations of people in that division. And at least one person, and Hans I think will confirm this, committed perjury, which if you lie to a federal law enforcement official, even if it's not in a court of law, that is considered a form of perjury, correct?
Right.
They lied to a federal investigator about their activities, and then they were confronted by their emails and finally acknowledged it. So this is someone who smeared people in their department, their colleagues, lied about it to federal investigators, committed a felony in doing that. And Hans, you pick up at this, how that person was treated and where that person
Yeah, she committed perjury in talking to the Inspector General investigators. She was neither disciplined nor terminated. In fact, she was treated as a hero by the Obama political appointees in the division. Why? Well, because she had been going after conservatives. And they didn't, they thought it was great that she had done it.
Martha Stewart went to jail.
I think there's another question.
If you have time to comment briefly, one on the situation with the Black Panthers in Philadelphia, and two, your thoughts on the current prosecution of that lower level Libyan terrorists in Washington, D.C.
Hans, go ahead.
Well, I know the lawyers who were involved in the new Black Panther voter intimidation case. As you all know, in that case, these new Black Panthers were dressed in paramilitary outfits. They had nightsticks. They were yelling racial epithets at people trying to go in to vote. The Justice Department filed a lawsuit against them for voter intimidation. It was a slam dunk case, and as soon as the Obama administration came in, they dismissed almost all of the case. Now, the most interesting thing about that is that in testimony before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, so this is sworn testimony by the head of the Civil Rights Division, and in sworn testimony before House committees by Eric Holder, They swore that no political appointees have been involved in making that decision, been done by career folks. And about a year ago, there was a decision issued by a federal judge in Washington. Judicial Watch had filed a Freedom of Information Act request to get all communications about this case and the dismissal from the Justice Department. Justice Department, the most transparent administration in history, of course, refused to turn this over. The judge, Judge Reggie Walton, ordered the Justice Department to release most of the documents, and in the order, he said, well, the documents that he had reviewed from the Justice Department indicated that, in fact, political appointees were involved in the decision, which called into question the sworn testimony of the head of the Civil Rights Division. So in other words, the head of the Civil Rights Division, a guy named Tom Perez, appointed by the President, had clearly committed perjury before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. So what did they do to him? The President nominated him to be the head of the Department of Labor, and he was confirmed. So he was basically rewarded for this. And this isn't my opinion that he lied. This is a federal judge saying that he had given misleading and wrong testimony to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. I can tell you the reason that case was dismissed. And this was made clear in the Inspector General report that John was talking about, which was released last year. This was an IG report on the mismanagement of the Civil Rights Division. It's because Eric Holder and the people who run the division do not believe in the race-neutral enforcement of our voting rights laws. The Voting Rights Act protects everyone from being discriminated against on the basis of race. They don't believe that. And because the defendants in that case were black, they did not believe that the case should be prosecuted.
But that's not what the law says. The law
That's
says
not what the law says. The law protects everyone. And in fact, when I was at the Justice Department filed and won the first case ever against local officials down in Mississippi, a place called Noxubee. Local black officials were engaging in blatant discrimination against white voters. And we won that case. It was confirmed by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. And I can tell you that the political appointees who've come into the division since then, many of them were in advocacy groups, they were extremely angry that we had filed that lawsuit and that we had won it. And they were extremely critical of us for doing that.
Kathleen?
I want to preface this by saying I'm not a lawyer. Thank God.
I'm not one either, I only play one on TV.
I'm just an ordinary person who tries to keep up with the news. But I'm hearing stuff and it's getting very disconcerting. You guys could be winning battles here and there, state, county, whatever. But we are losing the war, as far as I'm concerned, because I see this man and his cronies and his thugs and his punks as rogue. These are extremists and they're racists, and these are people who don't give a damn about the law. So we get involved in all of this little nuanced stuff about what the law says. They don't give a damn about that. They're breaking it.
Can you lead to a question?
So my question is this: what do we do with a president surrounded by thugs who are shredding this Constitution gladly? What do we do with him? What tools are available to us that will stop it and turn it back?
Okay.
We're frustrated.
Well, I did address that in the last part of my remarks, but I'll reiterate that and perhaps add some more context. You know, one of the hardest things in politics is to step back from the position you're sitting in. The place, you know, where you stand depends on where you sit. To step back and try to put yourself where your opponents are. Let me tell you one of the biggest mistakes that is made in politics, which is to misunderstand where the other side is coming from, exactly what they're up to, and how they feel about things. It's very difficult because it's very difficult to get into their mindset. Well, one of the curses of my life is I have to spend a lot of time around Democrats and liberals. I spend a lot of time with them. My latest column tonight, which quotes from a presidential historian who was a Democrat about Obama checking out like Woodrow Wilson checked out. Cases Obama's voluntarily doing it, Wilson did not do it voluntarily. They're not happy campers either. You know, the grass is always greener on the other side. Look at it from their perspective. They have an advantage, which is they're unmoored from morality and the law. Okay, that's an advantage. I mean, gives you some play in the joints. But slowly, things are closing in on them, slowly. The Supreme Court is an example, the lower courts, and by the way, I predict either tomorrow or next Tuesday, the District of Columbia panel for the U.S. Court of Appeals, which is the second highest court in the land, will declare the Obama insurance exchange unconstitutional. I make that prediction. Now, it has to go to the Supreme Court, but I will make that with a 99.5% confidence level. Now, I'm going out on a limb here. Now, I will freely confess that I predicted Obamacare would be declared unconstitutional, and I was ultimately wrong. I admit that. But for 100 days, when John Roberts had written the opinion for the majority declaring Obamacare unconstitutional, I was right. So I was right that John Roberts would declare Obamacare unconstitutional. I just wasn't right that he wouldn't change his mind. So I freely confess that I have a good track record, except there are occasional glitches. Now, from their point of view, they're going to lose the Senate. The best guess of the political prognosticators in Washington is the Senate is now 80% chance of gone for the Democrats. Now, as I said in my initial talks, which I hope you listened to, that means two things. It means if Obama wants any judges confirmed, he has to negotiate with the Republican Senate. That is not, given the record of Harry Reid, going to be an easy negotiation. In fact, there will be a price to every judge confirmed. There will be budget bills. The Justice Department has to operate in a budget. Budgets are sent to the president. He can't line item veto them. Maybe he should be able to, but he can't. So ultimately, there will be bills that Obama has to sign that will have appropriations riders and restrictions on the Justice Department that he will either have to sign or risk a confrontation with Congress, which he probably doesn't want to do because his approval rating is getting below 40%. And even look, just remember this. How many people in this room know that 1 out of 8 House Democrats voted to hold Eric Holder in contempt? How many people know that? Raise your hand. They won't tell you this. This is 2 years ago. This is not today, this is 2 years ago. 1 out of 8 House Democrats voted to hold Eric Holder in contempt. They are not happy campers. In fact, they are chafing under the Pelosi dictatorship. I mean, as one Democrat told me, I can't look at her anymore. It's not just because of the facelift. That's the only sexist comment I'm going to make tonight. I'm quoting someone, I'm not making it myself. The bottom line is, things are bad. I'm not sugarcoating them, but they're not as bad as you think. We have a system designed by the Founding Fathers, which is flawed, but it is very resilient. It survived largely intact after the Civil War. It survived largely intact Woodrow Wilson. It survived largely intact Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It survived largely intact Richard Nixon, Lyndon Johnson, Jimmy Carter.
Wait for that.
It survived, it's very, very resilient. We shouldn't give up on this country because frankly, A, we've been through worse and we've made it through. And the system corrects itself, albeit slowly like a battleship turning. But in addition, the Founding Fathers wouldn't want us to give up. They would not want us to give up. They would say we have to be steadfast and we have to be patient. We have to be both.
Ray, I'll come back to you a little bit. Somebody, who else wanted to, had a question?
Someone new.
It was just a very quick follow-up to
No,
it.
someone new.
Okay, that's fine.
Mark,
Yeah.
make it,
It'll be
no
quick.
speeches,
Just,
all right?
No speeches.
to go in line with what you said, compared to different attorney generals, can you say one would look no further just how Holder's gone after the banking industry? in a arbitrary and capricious manner when he's had people work for banks and then he goes after Citibank, Chase. It just seems, from my perspective, reading the periodicals, he's been more vehemently compared to past attorney generals.
Well, I'll just make an observation from a historical point of view. You've all heard of the robber barons and how Teddy Roosevelt broke up the trusts. Wrong. Teddy Roosevelt said they were good trusts and they were bad trusts. The good trusts were mean, awful people who operated against the public interest, but they were good trusts that were nice and kind and good for the country. A bad trust was the Rockefellers and Standard Oil, which at one point did have a 90% monopoly on the refining industry, which had gradually been shrinking down to about 62%. And that's when the federal government went after it. Not when it was at 90, but it was at 62. The reason was Rockefeller didn't like Teddy Roosevelt. But J.P. Morgan, who provided the financing for Roosevelt's grand design of the Panama Canal, which was financed by private Wall Street money, was a good trust because he operated the public interest. So they broke up Standard Oil while J.P. Morgan was allowed to prosper and run rampant. So, of course, all of this is political. Whenever you hear people screaming monopoly, it's because it's someone who doesn't have enough of a monopoly behind it. Now, I don't want to be cynical, but I will be. Which is, we don't have a free market in this country because far too much of our economy is politicized. Politicized by Wall Street bankers, too big to fail, politicized by corporate people who seek corporate welfare, which is why the fight for the Export-Import Bank is important. All of you people, no matter where you're stationed in life, no matter what your income is, are the little people. Because you're not anything close to Wall Street, you're anything close to the big boys. You're the people who pay the taxes and follow the rules. You're the people getting screwed by both parties. The one good thing that has happened, and frankly, since the defeat of Eric Cantor, it's finally happening again, is the Republican Party at least has a debate going on within inside itself. It's a debate. There's an establishment wing and a Tea Party wing. But at least there's a debate going on about the extent to which you should continue to be screwed. And I stand with the people who think you should be screwed a little bit less. I stand forthright with that. And luckily, follow the Export-Import Bank thing. It's a small thing, but it's basically the piggy bank for Boeing and Caterpillar to sell their stuff. I think they do good products. I like Caterpillar tractors and I like Boeing planes. I fly in them a lot. I think they can do just fine on their own. But they wanted an Export-Import Bank so they could get federal loan guarantees. Follow that issue. I think there's a battle for the soul of the Republican Party. And I can guarantee you that 99.5% of the people in this room are on one side, and the establishment of the Republican Party is on the other side. But you know what? Despite vote fraud in Mississippi, I think we can beat them. And that's why you're here. That's why we're fighting. And in November, I think the wave is going to be big enough. You're going to be a lot stronger, and the Republican establishment is going to be a lot weaker.
How about this side of the room? Frank?
Just an observation I was wondering if you could comment on. The last two Democrat presidents, Clinton had Janet Reno for the full 8 years. It looks like Eric Holder's going to be there for the full 8 years.
He will have to be.
Probably. But it looks as if you look at the Republican presidents in recent memory, they've all had maybe 2 or 3 attorneys general. Why is it that Democrats retain their attorneys general for their full 2 terms, but Republicans go through so?
Well, if your goal in life is to be a career bureaucrat, and you don't want to have a real life in the legal community, the answer is obvious. I mean, look, I don't want to disparage Eric Holder as a lawyer, but I will. Hans, this came in too late for the book, but his payout from the Washington law firm, what was it?
A lot.
No, it was $7 million.
Yes.
Eric Holder has never done, Eric Holder can't even count to $7 million. I mean,
right.
it is preposterous that Eric Holder got a $7 million payout from his law firm. Covington & Burling it was. here's a bit of advice for future Republican presidents. Do not nominate affirmative action and competence like Alberto Gonzalez. Now, I like Alberto Gonzalez. I've been in many green rooms for television programs with him. He's a perfectly charming, nice man who was completely unqualified to be the Attorney General of the United States. And he was appointed for only two reasons. One, his name was Alberto Gonzalez, and two, he was a friend of George W. Bush. That's not enough. Future Republican presidents need to have a higher standard. Now,
And that goes for the Supreme Court, I would assume as well.
well, let's not even go to Harriet Miers. If somebody wants to ask me a Harriet Miers question, I will answer it with relish. But that's not the question. So, John Ashcroft, I think, was a good Attorney General. And by the way, he stood up to the NSA bureaucrats from his hospital bed. This was a prosecutor, a former Attorney General of Missouri, and a former governor, and a Attorney General of the United States, who stood up to the NSA bureaucrats from his hospital bed where he was on death's door. Credit to him. And he was a prosecutor's prosecutor. He has won many awards for his prosecutions over the years. And there's no one who will question John Ashcroft's patriotism or commitment to national security. If there's anyone here who wants to question John Ashcroft's commitment to patriotism or national security, please raise your hand. Please raise your hand. Okay. One of the two before is still raising his hand. One person in this room raises his hand. Just a note. Alberto Gonzalez was a disaster. Mike Mukasey, who is also a prosecutorial hero, and someone I admired very, very strongly for standing up to Muslim terrorism and calling Muslim terrorism, not amorphous,
Workplace
man,
violence.
what is it, man?
Workplace violence.
Workplace violence, right. Was also a good Attorney General and served too short a time in Washington. So the answer is, we have to be very rigorous. Of course the other side is going to name disasters as Attorney General. That's a granted. There are going to be fewer Benjamin Civilettis and Griffin Bells coming from the other side. I mean, I didn't even take Janet Reno these days. She appointed 5 special prosecutors. Good credit to her. 0 when Eric Holder became her official minder, as Honda mentioned. So we have to have a higher standard. And we have to say, we have to have only the best. Only the best. So I agree with your question. I agree with your statement. And part of our job is to say what the other side is doing wrong. But part of our job is to hold our side to account and insist on the best and the most professional.
Sir.
John, do you think that Obama's actions over the past 5 years have done irreparable damage, and basically can the president now, future presidents will not all be uber presidents, I think as one pundit called them. Can you rein in the power, or will it be lopsided now going forward?
Well, I'll be very candid with your question. More candid than I've ever been. I will admit that if I'm wrong and Hillary Clinton is elected president, by the way, Charlie Cook, the Washington political handicapper extraordinaire, says there's a 40% chance she doesn't run. There's stuff you've not been told by the media. But if I'm wrong and she runs and she wins, we are in peril. Because once she climbs off her broomstick, we're in trouble. Hillary Clinton is more dangerous than Barack Obama because she's competent. And she will have a more competent Attorney General. You know, the problem, and I don't know if actually Hans and I have never discussed this. I actually believe that Eric Holder has been so obvious and frankly so unable to speak on his own behalf. He's been, this interview that he just conducted with ABC was the first network interview he had in 4 years. He's been so incompetent at his job of destroying the country that he's actually not been very good at it. He's been too obvious. He needed a softer, silkier touch, and they didn't get it with Eric Holder. So I actually believe that Hillary would be very dangerous on 2 levels. She'd be more competent than Obama, and she'd have a more competent Attorney General. So I don't think Hillary Clinton will be the next president of the United States, but if I'm wrong, batten down the hatches and examine New Zealand citizenship requirements.
Maybe it'll be Princess Liawatha.
Ray, did you have another question?
No, I was only, it was a quick comment on what you had said earlier about, you know, or what we can
All
do.
right, now we're represented by the Libertarian.
And it really went to, regardless of whether we take
I don't
this.
know exactly where we're
Any
at.
other questions before we wrap it up?
Yeah, it went
Yeah, we'll take a
to,
couple more questions.
all right, whatever.
Done.
Yeah, I was just curious, so what I think I heard earlier was that the Obama Justice Department, the Holder Justice Department, is going to be leaning on banks not to do business with businesses in the firearms industry and some sort of threat to harass them because they don't like what they do. The House the other day voted against a proposal to reverse a Justice Department policy that would have authorized banks to do business with these marijuana companies in those states where it's legal. The broader question is, we have federal laws that deal with marijuana. I might not agree with them, well, actually I do, but I might not agree with them, but they are constitutional laws, and yet it looks to me as though the Obama administration is just ignoring it as though it's not going on. Is there any truth to that, or
Well,
do they?
yeah, in fact, we have a whole chapter where we talk about that. And that's, in fact, one of the biggest problems with Eric Holder. Is, look, he's acting as if he and the president have a veto over any prior legislation passed by Congress and signed by a prior president. Look, you can argue about legalization of marijuana from a public policy standpoint. Sure. But there's a federal law on this, and it's not up to Eric Holder to say, well, I'm not going to enforce that. Another example we give, and I'm sure you all haven't heard about this, but there's this law called the Wire Act. And the Wire Act makes, it's always been interpreted to make internet gambling illegal. And in fact, there have been many cases
Unless Harry Reid wants it.
there have been many cases prosecuted under it in prior administrations, Republican and Democrat. Okay, well, 2 or 3 years ago, Illinois, the president's home state, wanted to start allowing internet gambling in Illinois for tax purposes, and all of a sudden, the Office of Legal Counsel at the Justice Department, which is the office that provides opinions on the constitutionality of legislation, they suddenly changed the 30-year interpretation of that law to say, oh, no, internet gambling's fine, doesn't violate the law. So that's just another example of how when they don't like a law, they won't enforce it. And Eric Holder is trying to spread this poison into the states. You all may have heard that there was a meeting of the National Attorney General's Association in Washington. And at that meeting, Eric Holder told the state attorney generals that, you really shouldn't defend a law if you don't like it, basically. And a number of attorney generals, including the Attorney General of Virginia, decided, oh yeah, I'm not going to defend a Virginia constitutional provision on marriage. Even though his duty, no matter what he believes about that, is to defend the Constitution. A number of other Democratic attorney generals followed him, and all the credit, I can't remember which one, there was one Democratic attorney general in the West who actually wrote a piece criticizing the president, and I'm sorry, criticizing the attorney general, saying, look, the whole point of our legal system is we have an adversarial system. And it's up to the adversaries to argue both sides of an issue and then let a judge or a jury make the decision. And basically, Eric Holder himself, and now telling state attorney generals they shouldn't do that. That they should just make the decision on their own on laws that they don't like. And that is extremely dangerous. And there may be people today, liberals, who like the policy outcomes this produces, but they ought to realize this is setting a precedent. You know, if a Republican gets elected in 2016 and appoints Attorney General, maybe that Attorney General will say, well, we're not going to defend laws that liberals like and think ought to be enforced, and he'll have the precedent of saying, well, I'm just doing what Eric Holder established.
And just to pick up on what Hans said, there is a reason why we've only had one civil war in our history. And the answer is the rule of law. Politics is war conducted by other means. It's hard combat, it's often vicious, it's often deplorable, but it's not violent. And throughout our history, we have retreated to the rule of law as something that keeps us together enough that we can settle our differences or at least continue them without resorting to violence. When you retreat from the rule of law and you go to the rule of men, you create circumstances in which people in this country feel their government does not represent them and all bets are off. We want to avoid that. There are right now in this country people who are very angry. They're forming militias. They're forming groups that say that the government is illegitimate. Now, regardless of their legitimate or illegitimate grievances, we don't want to get to that point. The reason we have remained free and prosperous and a good place to raise families and provide for future generations is we have relied on the rule of law. And the danger that Eric Holder and Barack Obama represent is if you abandon the rule of law, all bets are off, which is why we have to constantly return to it as our standard, because it what keeps us free and what keeps us away from each other's throat.
Ray, now you have a question.
Okay, no, it's actually the same
Actually,
question.
can we get a new?
Yeah,
I don't
that's
have
fine.
any
No, it's
problem,
all
I just
good.
want to get a new
It's fine.
one.
Yeah, do you expect that Lois Lerner will be testifying before Congress with immunity?
Well, I tell you, interesting, because I think about that, and because I've written about this. Lois Lerner actually does not need to be given immunity by Congress. And the reason for that is that, yeah, she did assert the Fifth Amendment before Congress. And then she did it again a second time, right? But, well, there was an interesting news conference held that almost got no press by her lawyer after the second time she came in and asserted the Fifth. And at that news conference, her lawyer said that she had given a lengthy statement about what had happened to the U.S. Justice Department. Now, what's interesting about that is that, and I'm not sure a lot of lawyers know this, but the District of Columbia courts have a rule that is different from the rest of the country. Everywhere else in the country, the fact that you voluntarily give a statement to the government doesn't mean that the next time you talk to the government, you can still assert the Fifth Amendment. That's not the rule of the District of Columbia. In the District of Columbia, the rule established by the courts is that if you voluntarily talk to the government, you cannot in the future assert the Fifth Amendment. Now, as you all know, Lois Lerner was held in contempt by the House, just like the Attorney General. This was May 8th. The contempt citation was forwarded to the United States Attorney in the District of Columbia. And there's actually a federal statute that says that when a House of Congress holds someone in contempt, that is to be forwarded to the U.S. Attorney, and the U.S. Attorney shall present that to a grand jury. There's no discretion. The U.S. Attorney doesn't have any discretion to decide not to do it. He has to present it to a federal grand jury. And the grand jury then looks at it, and if they want to punish the person for the contempt citation, they can put him in jail for up to a year. It's almost the end of July, and the U.S. Attorney has not said a word about the contempt citation. It hasn't been presented to a grand jury, and this is just another instance where the Justice Department is refusing to follow the law.
And in wrapping up, I'll simply add to what Hans says. The Justice Department is a curious beast right now. We have had an investigation of the IRS scandal now for 14 months. I happen to know 22 people at the center of the IRS scandal. Groups that have been mistreated, applications delayed, people you'd want to talk to. By my last count, 20 of the 22 have never been interviewed by the FBI or the Justice Department in 14 months. Just yesterday, the Justice Department announced,
There we go.
oh, we've just woken up from our Rip Van Winkle slumbers and decided that maybe we should look into the emails being eaten by the computer over at the IRS. So we are officially notifying Congress. We actually might be sort of, maybe, kind of, interested in those emails being lost. Now, this was over 2 months ago. Now, I know lawyers are busy, and I know news travels slowly these days, much more slowly than it has in the past. But I mean, this is an insult. This is just an insult. Now, I will say, let me end on a cheerful note. If you thought Chairman Darrell Issa has been aggressive,
Trey Gowdy.
well, we don't even go into Trey Gowdy, that's Benghazi. We can talk about Benghazi later. By the way, the truth about Benghazi will come out. I'll make that prediction too. It won't be pretty, but it will come out. The truth about Benghazi will come out. Trey Gowdy and Darrell Issa can be very aggressive, but the quiet hero of aggressive congressional investigations is Charles Grassley of Iowa. Charles Grassley of Iowa is a senator from Iowa. And if the Republicans take the Senate, he will be directing the investigations. You do not want to mess with Charles Grassley's staff. You could walk through their deepest sympathy for the Obama administration and not get your ankles wet. They've only been held back because the Republicans are in the minority. If the Republicans hold the House and the Senate, there's going to be a lot of hearings, and they'll be very illuminating. People always ask me, is Eric Holder going to stay? You know, I told Hans when we began the book, I'm 100% confident Eric Holder will stay in office as Attorney General until January 20th, 2017 at 12 noon. For two reasons. One, if he resigned, he'd have to be replaced in a confirmation hearing before the U.S. Senate. Obama does not want a confirmation hearing on the Attorney General of the United States. Secondly, if Eric Holder were to leave office before January 20th, 2017, he would have a new occupation. That would be called permanent witness. That's not an occupation you apply for with any kind of relish. I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank you for your excellent questions. On behalf of Hans, thank you.